Racist bullies thought stomping on Big Shaq's dog would send a message, but they had no idea who they were provoking. When Big Shaq called the police commander, the ground beneath Savannah started to shift. What began as cruelty turned into a citywide reckoning. This wasn't about a dog anymore. It was about legacy, power, and the fire you can't stomp out. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun had just begun to spill over the rooftops of Savannah, Georgia, casting long golden lines across the pavement. The kind of morning that made people pause and breathe, where the dew still clung to porch steps and neighbors exchanged quiet nods between sips of coffee. It was one of those days when the world felt good, safe, at least on the surface. Shaquille O'Neal, known to this town as Big Shaq, walked slow and easy through the sidewalks, justice at his side. The golden retriever, 10 years old, but still full of energy, trotted with purpose, tail wagging like she had something important to say. People greeted Shaq as he passed. A group of kids playing hopscotch waved, yelling his name. A mail carrier tipped his cap. A few older women on a porch offered fresh biscuits. Shaq took it all in with that familiar grin, the one that had graced championship podiums and late-night interviews. But here he wasn't the basketball legend or TV personality. He was just a neighbor. A man who had stayed, who had chosen to live not behind iron gates, but right where the people were. Shaq had always been about presence. His size, his heart, his voice. But this morning, something felt off. As he turned the corner onto Chatham Lane, Justice hesitated. Her tail dropped. She let out a low growl, almost inaudible. Shaq looked up. That's when he saw them. 3 boys. Maybe 17 or 18. Standing near the edge of a parked truck, arms crossed, grinning like they owned the world. Their clothes were spotless, expensive. One had a country club emblem stitched into his collar. But their eyes, those told a different story. Cold, focused, mean. Shaq didn't recognize them personally, but he'd seen the type. They didn't grow up in this part of Savannah. They were the kind who inherited land, titles, and the illusion that they could step on whoever they pleased. Still, Shaq wasn't the type to start trouble. He nodded politely, tugging Justice's leash gently. But they didn't nod back. The tallest boy took a step forward and spat on the sidewalk. "Didn't know they let zoo animals walk their pets around here," he said, voice loud and syrupy with mock southern charm. The others laughed too hard like they were performing for someone. Shaq stopped. Not because he was scared, not because he was angry. He'd heard worse. He'd lived through worse. But because Justice had moved between him and the boys, like she knew something he didn't. "Just taking my dog for a walk," Shaq said quietly, almost to himself. The second boy stepped in, looked down at Justice, then back at Shaq. "Looks like your mutt's got more sense than you, knows where the real danger is." Then came the third one, shorter, stockier, with a smug look plastered across his face. Without warning, he stomped hard on the sidewalk, causing Justice to flinch and whimper. That should have been the end of it. A scare, a stupid childish show of dominance. But it didn't stop there. The boys moved in faster than Shaq expected, not hitting him, not touching him at all, but going straight for Justice. They laughed as they kicked at her, stomped her side, her paws, her ribs. She cried out, a high human-like scream that split the morning open. Shaq's arms moved before his mind caught up, but not fast enough. He shouted, begged them to stop, but they weren't listening. It wasn't about the dog. It was about power, about seeing if they could break something he loved. For a moment, Shaq froze. It was a feeling he hadn't known since childhood. Helplessness, the kind that sits heavy in the chest, that reminds you how society sees your skin before your soul. He wasn't Shaquille the millionaire. He wasn't the Hall of Famer. He was just a black man, watching white boys destroy something precious, daring him to move so they could escalate it into something darker. Justice collapsed onto the pavement, trembling, her breathing uneven. And then, quietly, Shaq reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, not for a wallet, but for a small black phone. A burner, a line not tied to public view or press calls, just one number on speed dial. One voice on the other end, that mattered. He pressed it. 1 ring. 2. The call connected. "Commander Griggs," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion. "It's Shaquille." There was a pause. Shaq's voice dropped. "They hurt her." Another pause. Longer this time. Then a clipped response. I'm coming. Shaq didn't even look at the boys. They were still grinning, until they noticed the phone, until they saw his expression shift from helpless to composed. They watched him kneel next to Justice, cradling her gently, whispering the kind of things only someone who's loved deeply could whisper. The SUV arrived 10 minutes later. No sirens, no lights, just black-tinted windows and silence. By then the boys had stepped back, uncertain. One of them tried to laugh it off. We were just messing around. But Shaq didn't answer. He lifted Justice carefully into the arms of a medic, who emerged from the SUV. Someone in uniform, but not a regular cop. The men didn't speak. They moved with purpose, precision, like this wasn't the first time they'd cleaned up something the town wanted to hide. The boys froze, for real this time, not in fear of Shaq, but in fear of the unknown, of what kind of man didn't call the police. But the Commander Griggs didn't make eye contact with Shaq. Not yet. He stared hard at the boys instead, then turned and motioned for the SUV to drive. As it pulled away, Shaq remained on the sidewalk, alone again. Except for the silence left behind, neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the noise, the emotion, the unfamiliar SUV. Some recorded, others whispered, but no one moved closer. Shaq stood tall, dusted his jeans off and looked at the blood on his hands. It wasn't much, just a drop or two from Justice's paw, but it was enough. Enough to change something. Because this wasn't just about a dog. It never was. And in the distance, above the slow hum of traffic and the return of morning sounds, the whispers began to shift. Did you see who came for him? Not the cops. The commander. What does that mean? It meant the game had changed, and Shaq was done playing quiet. Griggs nodded, signaling to the vet tech who stepped out from the rear of the SUV, moving with quiet urgency. No badges, no patches, just calm precision as they lifted Justice and carried her toward the vehicle. Shaq watched without speaking. He didn't say thank you. Griggs didn't expect him to. She's still alive, Shaq said, his voice rough from holding too much in. But I don't know how long. Behind them, the boys started murmuring. One of them, the tall one with the smug face from earlier, spoke up. We didn't even touch him. Just a dog. Why is everyone acting like we committed murder? The boys didn't answer. They didn't need to. Their eyes told the story. They knew. But knowing was different than understanding. They didn't understand what it meant to cross a line not drawn in law books, but in lives lived through quiet resistance. Do you know who you put your hands on? He asked flatly. Griggs turned toward them. Slow, measured. He studied them the way a man reads a case file line by line, knowing the real story hides in the margins. Then he stepped forward, just enough to silence their whispers. The crowd that had started to form earlier was still present, neighbors with phones in hand, recording everything. A few murmurs passed through like drifting smoke. One of the boys opened his mouth to speak again, but Griggs cut him off with a single glance. Not threatening, not loud, just final. Why didn't they call regular police? Isn't that Griggs? Why is he treating a dog like it's national security? But Griggs knew what they were really asking. Why was this different? What had they missed? Griggs turned back to Shaq. We'll get her to a private facility. No press, no reports, just care. Shaq nodded, his jaw set. And the boys? Griggs hesitated for the first time. It was subtle, just the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I'll handle it. Griggs leaned closer, his voice dropping. You've stirred something here, bigger than those boys, bigger than me. I know exactly what it was, Griggs said. But something in his tone wavered, like he was trying to convince himself of something. He looked away toward the road, then back at the house across the street where a curtain had just moved. You better do more than handle it, Shaq replied, voice low, barely controlled. You know what this was? Don't pretend it wasn't. Shaq studied him. So what you saying? Back off? Shaq stood in the middle of the street, as neighbors began drifting back into their homes, conversations hushed but buzzing. He felt the shift, not just the social kind, but the kind in the gut, the kind that told you a warning had just been delivered without words. I'm saying, be careful. Griggs didn't elaborate. He turned, walked back to the SUV, and within seconds it rolled away, with Justice inside. He returned home in silence. The house, once a place of rest, now buzzed with tension. Mamara met him at the door, her eyes wide, red-rimmed. She hadn't seen what happened, but had read the texts, seen the pictures from nearby phones, watched it all unfold through viral chaos. "Daddy, what the hell happened?" she whispered, trying to stay strong. Shaq couldn't answer right away. He just pulled her into his arms and held on. Her heartbeat was fast, her fear louder than her voice, and when he finally stepped back, he saw something shift in her too, anger where her light used to be. "They're saying you called the feds," she muttered. "Some online threads calling you cop elite. Some are calling you a traitor." Mara looked down, then said it before she could think better of it. "Justice didn't deserve that, and neither do you." Shaq let out a breath. "Let them talk." Shaq walked to the back porch, watching as the sunlight bent through the trees. He remembered mornings like this with his mom, Lucille teaching him how to walk proud, how to stand tall, how to choose silence when the world wanted rage. But this time, silence wasn't cutting it. Griggs had shown up, yes. But the hesitation, it meant something was brewing. And if a man like Griggs, clean, sharp, career-conscious, was nervous, it meant lines were being drawn behind curtains. The kind that didn't care who Shaquille O'Neal was. The kind that had no leash. Inside the house, Mira's phone buzzed again. She read something and gasped. She kept reading. "Another one? His uncle's the deputy mayor." Shaq turned slowly. "Dad," she called, stepping outside. "One of the boys? His dad is the judge who ruled on that business discrimination case you funded." He didn't say anything. He just sat on the porch steps. Let the weight of it all settle. This wasn't a random act. It was a message, and the commander may have picked up. But Shaq now understood. Bigger than all of them. This was bigger than justice. In the fight, it had only just begun. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual that morning, like it knew something had cracked in the air and was counting down to what came next. Shaq sat at the table with his hands folded tight, eyes locked on the same spot on the floor where Justice used to curl up in the morning sun. The dog bed still sat by the window, untouched, and it made the silence in the house ring louder. Mira moved like a ghost in the background, phone in hand, thumbs flying. Her face was clenched, not in panic, but in calculation, the kind of expression a young girl wears when she's deciding if the world deserves her rage. The front door opened without a knock, and the sound of heels hitting the hardwood echoed like a declaration. Lucille O'Neal didn't do silent entrances. She stepped into the house like a storm wrapped in pearls, head high, coat slung over her shoulder, and eyes that had seen too much to blink at drama. Shaq stood as soon as she walked in. "Mama." She didn't say a word at first, just looked him up and down, her stare sharper than any question. Her eyes paused at the dried spot on his jeans near the knee. Justice's blood. Then she looked back at his face. "You sat there and watched?" she asked, not judging, not accusing, just confirming. Shaq lowered his head. "I didn't have time to stop it." Lucille walked forward and pulled out the chair beside him. "You had time to breathe. Time to think. That's more than I had when they came for us back in Baton Rouge." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly when she set her purse down. That was how Shaq knew this wasn't just another visit. She hadn't come to cook or preach, or fuss over Mira's college plans. She came because something old and ugly had been stirred from the past, and she knew the scent of it too well. Lucille reached for the pot of coffee on the counter, poured a cup without asking, and took a long sip. Then she fixed her gaze on her son. "This ain't about no dog, baby," she said finally. "It's about them knowing who you are, and wanting to take it from you." Shaq stared at her, unsure if she was exaggerating or seeing something he'd missed. But deep down he already knew she was right. Justice had been the target, but he had been the purpose. Lucille continued, her tone low and razor sharp. "These boys didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt an animal. They were raised in homes where cruelty was dinner conversation. You think it's a coincidence their daddies sit in city offices and wear polished smiles while signing off on policies that keep us out? Please." They sent a message. Not with bullets, not with fists, but with a leash. In the living room, Mira let out a frustrated grunt. "I posted it. The whole thing. Timeline. SUV. Justice. All of it. It's blowing up." Lucille didn't turn, but her voice carried. "You should have waited." Mira whipped around. Waited for what? For them to post their version first? For the city to paint Daddy as aggressive? No way. This one's ours. And people are listening. She held out her phone for them to see. The post already had 80,000 likes. Thousands of comments. A wave of empathy. A storm of backlash. Hate and hope. Neck and neck. Shaq reached for the phone and scrolled. He saw support from fellow athletes, messages from fans, celebrities speaking out. But then came the rot, racial slurs, threats, accusations that he staged it for attention. And then in the middle of it all, one anonymous comment that made his stomach turn cold. "You're not safe anymore, big man. Not in this town." He handed the phone back without a word. Lucille saw his face tighten. What did it say? Shaq hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing worth repeating. She leaned forward, grabbed his chin gently like she used to when he was a boy. "Don't you lie to me, son. I told you my eyes don't lie. But neither do yours. So tell me." He finally repeated the message. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Mira sat down now, for the first time since the morning began. Her voice cracked. What if they come here again? What if they try something worse? Shaq looked at her, eyes fierce. "They won't. I promise you." Lucille shook her head slowly. "You can't make promises like that. Not when you just put a spotlight on the whole nest." Shaq stood and paced. "I couldn't stay quiet, Mama. I couldn't let them do that to her, and pretend it was nothing. I called Griggs. I called the one man who owed me something." Lucille's eyes narrowed. "And you think that debt will hold up when the whole town leans on him? Don't be naive. That man works in a system built to protect itself. You think he can fight the judge, the mayor, and every white pocketbook in Savannah just 'cause he likes you? Baby, debts like that don't stand up to pressure. They fold. Fast." Shaq's jaw clenched. "Then I'll handle it myself." "You won't handle it alone," Mara said, cutting in. "We're not going quiet. Not this time." Lucille looked at her granddaughter, a small smile forming despite the weight of the moment. "You sound like your granddaddy when the union tried to break him down." He said something similar, right before they took his job. The tension in the room thickened. Mimara didn't flinch. "Then we'll build our own damn job," she replied. Lucille's smile faded, but the pride didn't. She took a deep breath, set her cup down, and rose to her feet. "All right. If this is the road we're walking, then we walk it together. But you better understand, both of you, this won't stay about a dog. It won't stay about 3 boys. It'll become about who has power and who doesn't. And they'll do whatever they have to do to make sure you remember your place." Shaq nodded. He'd been told to know his place his whole life, and every time he proved them wrong, they shifted the goalposts. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. A thick envelope left on the porch. No signature, no return address. Inside were 3 things. A photo of Justice lying injured, clearly taken from a distance. A printed screenshot of Mira's post, circled in red. And a note. "Back off, or this gets worse." Shaq stood there holding the pieces like they were burning in his hands. Lucille didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She just crossed her arms and stared him down. "Now, do you believe me?" Shaq nodded, slow and grim, because Lucille's eyes never lied. And what they saw now was war. Griggs sighed. "You're right, but the city's watching now. Lawyers are involved. I'm being told to take a step back until it's all sorted." "You're being told?" A pause. Then the call dropped. Not ended. Dropped. Miora stood near the hallway, arms crossed, scrolling through her phone again. "I'm getting death threats in my inbox. Real ones. IPs are bouncing through different servers, but they're consistent. Pictures of our house, of me, stuff they shouldn't have access to." Lucille, who'd been quiet all day, finally set down her sewing and looked up. "That's not teenage nonsense. That's organized. Somebody wants to scare you quiet." Justice lay nearby on a bed of blankets, breathing slow, eyes half-lidded. Every few hours, a nurse sent by Griggs came in to check vitals, whispering that the vet was doing all he could, but no one promised recovery, no one dared. Shaq stepped away from the table and paced the living room. Griggs was solid. "I don't understand." Lucille watched him closely. "Solid don't mean clean. Baby, the moment power calls in favors, even the best man folds. You taught me that. Remember how you used to say fame is a house with mirrors for walls? You can see everybody, but everyone's watching you too." He stopped pacing. "You think he was threatened?" "I think he was reminded who signs his paycheck." Shaq didn't answer, because deep down, he knew she was right. Griggs wasn't a villain. But he wasn't built for this kind of war either. And now, the boys were untouchable, free, and emboldened. They were laughing in private group chats, Chandler had already liked a meme mocking big man tears. Braden had been spotted at a country club mixer the same evening. Justice was rushed to surgery. Hunter had been given a public commendation by his father's judicial committee for character-building volunteer service. Character. The word curdled in Shaq's throat. Later that night, Mira burst into the room, phone gripped in her hand like it might catch fire. "They're planning something." Lucille looked up. "Who is?" Mira's voice was quick, shaky. "They've got a thread going under some private Twitter list, only accessible through backdoor links. They're tracking Dad, calling him a liar, saying the footage was staged. Some are even suggesting Justice's injuries are fake." Shaq leaned in. "You're sure?" She nodded, holding out the screen. "Screenshots. I already sent them to 3 lawyers." Shaq took the phone and scrolled. The usernames were anonymous, but some were too familiar. One profile had been used by a campaign volunteer for the mayor. Another was tied to a developer who'd been in a lawsuit with Shaq's business foundation 2 years ago. Lucille stood slowly, went to the hallway closet, and pulled out an old wooden box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were yellowing papers, photos, letters from decades ago. She handed one to Shaq. A newspaper clipping from the late 80s. A headline that read, "Local man fired after filing racial complaint against Judge Greeley's law firm." Lucille said nothing. She didn't need to. Shaq read the name under the headline. Her brother. His uncle. A man who'd vanished from family gatherings after the lawsuit drained everything he had. No one ever proved it was retaliation. But everyone knew. "This goes way back," Lucille murmured. Mira sat down beside Justice, resting a hand gently on the dog's back. "We're not just dealing with racism, we're dealing with a dynasty. A whole town built around protecting itself." Shaq stared at the wall, his thoughts moving faster than his words. The boys were puppets. Their actions were awful. Yes, but they weren't the architects. They were raised like weapons, taught that power meant immunity, that cruelty, when done quietly or through layers, was just a game of inheritance. And now, someone had sent them out to rattle the cage of a man who wasn't supposed to react. Shaq had always been quiet in his resistance. Donations, scholarships, speeches. But none of those shook foundations. None of those made enemies feel exposed. This incident, it had done both. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keys, not to tweet, not to post, but to write something deeper. A statement. A record, not of what happened, but of what was coming. Because this time, silence wasn't protection. It was permission. As the night wore on, Mira continued to monitor her messages. Lucille made tea like nothing was wrong. And Shaq typed slowly, deliberately, naming every boy, every connection, every injustice they'd uncovered, not for revenge, but for record. So when the truth came knocking, it wouldn't come alone. It would bring proof, receipts, and the weight of history. The boys' daddies wore badges, but this family, they wore truth. And it fit just fine. The morning after the threats began to circle in full view, the tone of the city shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was subtle, too subtle. Like the air got just a bit thicker. Like the greetings at coffee shops were more forced. Like doors didn't stay open for him quite as long. Shaq could feel it. Savannah had started the slow lean away from him. Not all of it, but enough. Then came the broadcast. It hit midday, a segment tucked between traffic updates and a light story about a new community park. But its weight dropped like a hammer. The anchor, Whitney Kane, had the kind of smile that made people forget she'd been tied to more cover-ups than she'd ever reported. She wore a pearl necklace, and the posture of someone too polished to flinch at lies. The camera framed her cleanly as she leaned forward, voice syrupy smooth. In a developing story, sources now suggest that former basketball star Shaquille O'Neal may have exaggerated the details of a recent neighborhood incident involving his pet. Officials claim that the situation may have escalated due to heightened emotional response, not intentional harm. We urge the public to await the official findings of the internal review. The screen then cut to B-roll of Shaq, smiling at a community event from years prior, as if to say, "Look how harmless he used to be." Mira snapped the remote across the room before the segment ended. "They're rewriting it, Dad. Just like you said they would." Shaq stood behind her, arms crossed, not angry, not yelling, just tired. That deep tired that lives in the bones of every black man who's ever had to defend his truth from people, determined to distort it. Lucille sat in the corner, eyes closed, lips pressed into a line. She'd lived the spin cycle before, in church basements, in courtrooms, in the silence after headlines shifted the blame. But now it wasn't just a story. It was her son, her granddaughter, their home. You staying quiet? She asked without opening her eyes. Shaq looked over at her. Not this time. Within an hour he was ready, not for war, but for truth. He didn't hire a PR team, didn't craft a perfect statement. He clicked the go leave button on his phone, held it steady in his own hands, and looked straight into the camera. The living room behind him was plain. No awards in the frame, no jerseys, just wood-paneled walls and the faint sound of Justice breathing from a blanket-covered bed nearby. Hey, he began, his voice rough. I don't know how to do this the right way, so I'm just gonna talk. He paused, not to build tension, but because his throat caught. My name is Shaquille O'Neal. Most of y'all know me as Big Shaq. I've been called a lot of things: athlete, entertainer, investor. But before all that, I was a black boy in Newark, New Jersey, learning real fast what the world thinks of people who look like me. He shifted slightly, eyes glassing over. This past week, someone tried to remind me of that. Not with words, not with fists, but with a message. A message sent through a dog I love, through silence from people I trusted, and through a city trying real hard to pretend it doesn't see what's happening. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. They say I'm exaggerating, that what happened to Justice was an accident, that I imagined the hate in those boys' eyes, that maybe I'm too emotional to remember it right. His lips tightened, but I remember everything. He recounted the morning, the laughter, the eyes, the weight of watching something innocent, being hurt just to hurt him. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he cried. I've played with pain, I've been booed in arenas full of people, but nothing cuts deeper than knowing the world still thinks black grief is up for debate. The live stream exploded within minutes. 10,000 viewers. Then 50. Celebrities reposted. Civil rights advocates clipped pieces and quoted him. Every outlet that ignored the dog attack before now scrambled to pick up the broadcast. And not everyone was moved. Within hours, protest formed outside his home. But they weren't supportive. Pickup trucks lined the curb. Men in tactical vests, holding flags that had nothing to do with the country. Signs that read, "Don't play the race card," and "Dogs don't justify lies." A few even shouted through bullhorns, demanding he debate the facts. Lucille stood at the window and watched them, unmoved. It's always the same script, different decade. Inside, Mara's phone kept buzzing. She opened an email from her school. It warned of potential disruptions if her father didn't lower the media tone around the family. Her hands shook, but she didn't cry. She just handed the phone to Shaq and walked into the backyard. That's when she saw it. Smoke, not rising from a chimney, but from the far corner of the fence. She screamed. Shaq and Lucille rushed outside, and there, near the back gate, Justice's doghouse was ablaze. The fire was small, contained, set carefully to send a message, not destroy the house. On the fence behind it, spray-painted in dripping black letters, were 3 chilling words. You were warned. Mira's voice cracked as she spoke. They did this. Shaq didn't answer. He grabbed the hose, sprayed the flames, until the wood hissed to silence. He stared at the message for a long time, water dripping from the nozzle like blood from a wound. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back inside. Lucille followed, whispering something only he heard. I told you, baby. This was never about a dog. Inside, the tension wrapped around them like smoke. Justice whimpered softly from her corner. Mara sat beside her, not saying anything. Her shoulders shook quietly, eyes wet. That night, Shaq didn't sleep. He paced the house, room to room, past the pictures on the walls, past the trophies collecting dust. All of it felt small now. All of it felt like a shield that had cracked. He called Griggs. It rang. No answer. He called again. Voicemail. On the third try, Griggs picked up, but his voice was clipped, breathless. Shaquille. I can't talk right now. It's getting bad on my end. Real bad. Shaq's tone was calm. They set fire to her doghouse. A long pause. Then I suggest you get a camera on every window. Because what's coming next? Griggs whispered. It's not about making you back down anymore. It's about making sure nobody follows you. Then the line went dead. Shaq sat in the dark for a while. No lights. just the sound of the city in the distance, and the heartbeat of a home under siege. But when morning came, he didn't kneel. He stood on the front porch, looked down the street, and made one silent promise. You can scare me, you can smear me, but I won't move. Because Big Shaq doesn't kneel. He rises. The knock came just after 8 p.m. Soft, almost hesitant. Not the kind of knock that said friend or enemy, but one that lived somewhere between fear and obligation. Shaq was sitting in his study, the lights low, Justice asleep beside him, her body still frail but breathing steady now. Mira was in the kitchen on her laptop, and Lucille was crocheting silently in the corner of the living room, like she was weaving calm into the chaos. When the knock came again, Shaq stood and opened the door with quiet caution. There stood Tori Malden, a young officer barely out of her academy years, with sharp features and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much too fast. Her uniform was crisp, but her posture wasn't. She held her shoulders like she'd been bracing against the wind all week. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, keeping her voice down. "Can I come in? Just for a second?" Shaq nodded and motioned her in. Tori stepped inside carefully, her eyes scanning the living room, catching Lucille's gaze. Lucille looked her up and down, not rudely, but like she was measuring something that wasn't on paper. Tori didn't sit. She stayed standing, as if sitting would make her part of this house, this moment, and she couldn't afford that. "I'm not here on official business," she said. "No one knows I'm here, and if they find out, I'll be out of a job, maybe worse." Shaq watched her carefully. "So why come?" Tori took a breath, reached into her coat, and pulled out a small flash drive. She held it like it was something cursed, like it burned her just to touch it. "Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to, and you deserve to see it too." She placed the drive on the coffee table, stepped back like it might detonate. Mira had wandered closer now, watching from behind the kitchen archway, arms crossed. Shaq leaned forward but didn't reach for it yet. "What is it?" "Body cam footage," Tori said quietly. "From one of the officers who responded that morning. The camera was never logged. It should have been wiped." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Then how do you have it?"
"I was working a double shift, ended up doing tech support for a couple of transfers. One of them dropped his cam file in the wrong folder. I saw the timestamp, got curious, and then I watched it."
Lucille rose now, slowly, coming to stand beside the coffee table. "What exactly did you see, officer?" Tori hesitated, then finally said it. "The boys. Before they attacked. They were standing in that alley, talking like it was a game, laughing. One of them, Chandler I think, said something like, 'Watch when we mess with the big ape and his mud,' and the others laughed. One of them even said he won't fight back, too scared to lose his endorsement checks. They knew what they were doing. It wasn't random." Silence fell like a curtain. Tori went on, more quietly now. "But that's not all." She swallowed. "After the vet took the dog, Commander Griggs showed up on that same body cam. You were already gone, Mr. O'Neill." Griggs told the officer to hand over the device. The camera was still rolling, and it caught him saying, "This footage doesn't exist. Understand? Nobody needs to see this circus. We protect the city by managing perception." Mimara inhaled sharply. Lucille didn't move, her face like carved granite. Shaq's hands were clenched now, but not shaking. "Steady. You realize what this means?" he asked. Tori nodded, her voice nearly a whisper. "If this gets out, it's not just the department that burns. The mayor, the judge, the chief, all of them have strings tied to this. You won't just be going up against Savannah. You'll be going up against the state, maybe higher. And what happens to you?" She gave a sad half-smile. "I'll be out. Maybe blacklisted. Maybe worse. But I can't carry this and stay silent. I didn't sign up to be part of a cover-up." Shaq finally picked up the flash drive, turned it in his hand. It felt heavier than metal. Lucille's voice cut through the quiet. "This isn't just evidence. It's the match and the fuse. You used this, son, and you better be ready for what comes." Miara stepped forward. "We have to leak it. Not to the local news. They'll bury it. We go bigger. National." Tori looked at her, surprised. "That could backfire. They'll say it's doctored. That it's deepfake tech. You'll need witnesses, experts, a whole legal army." Shaq finally stood. "We've got truth. That's the first weapon." He turned to Tori. "Why bring it to me directly? Why not drop it anonymously?" She looked him in the eyes. "Because you were the only one I trusted not to twist it. He gave a single nod. Then you did the right thing. She stepped back toward the door, already glancing out the window. I need to go. This meeting never happened. If they ask, I was on patrol in South Garden. Lucille walked her to the door, watching her until she disappeared into the dark. Then she turned back to her son. Well, baby, she said softly, you've got your proof. Question is, what are you gonna do with it? Shaq didn't answer right away. He sat back down, inserted the drive into his laptop, and opened the footage. He watched it all. Every laugh,
Every slur.
every piece of strategy they'd spoken aloud, without fear of consequence. Then came the moment Griggs appeared on screen, looking older, tired, but controlled. His voice was calm, firm, the authority of a man trying to bury a fire before it spread. End the recording. Delete it from the system. This isn't for public consumption. Shaq closed the laptop slowly. Lucille whispered. He made his choice. Miara stepped forward. Now it's our turn. Shaq looked up. His voice was clear. Call Shawnee. Tell her I need a strategist. And tell Corbin Hale we've got something the courts can't ignore. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It never was. The truth had a voice now. And Shaq was done whispering. The car pulled up just after dusk. Blacked out windows, city plates, and no ceremony. It didn't need any. The second Shawnee Henderson stepped out in her steel gray heels and blazer sharp enough to slice air. The wind in Savannah seemed to shift. Her presence was gravity, measured, composed, unshaken. Time hadn't dulled her. If anything, it refined her. The kind of woman who left rooms quieter than she entered them, simply because people knew she came with purpose. Not drama, not nostalgia, just business. Shaq stood on the porch, arms crossed as she approached. Their eyes met, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a tension that ran deep, carved by years of complicated history and a daughter they both loved like breath. It had been 4 years since she moved to Chicago, longer since they'd seen eye to eye, but when the flash drive hit his hands, and Mara said, "Call Mom," Shaq knew who the situation needed. Shawnee didn't offer a hug or a handshake. She just looked at him and said, "You still making that bitter coffee?" Shaq cracked a grin. "Only on days that end in hell." Inside, Mayara ran to her, arms outstretched. The reunion wasn't soft, but it was warm. Mayara had grown into herself. A fierce spirit, a voice that refused silence, but in her mother's arms, she was still someone's little girl. Lucille watched from the kitchen doorway, eyes narrowed but curious. She and Shawnee had always had a relationship built on respect, not softness. Steel recognizing steel, and Lucille knew better than to question the timing. "Long time," Shawnee said to her, nodding. Lucille responded with a simple, "You came when it mattered." That was enough. Within the hour, Shawnee had her laptop open on the dining table, the body cam footage loaded and ready. She replayed it twice, once in silence, once with Mira reading the transcript she'd drafted for clarity. Shaq stood by the window, arms crossed, watching not the video but the reflection of everything they were about to do. Shawnee leaned back in her chair. "This isn't a leak," she said firmly. "This is a bullet, and if you shoot it the wrong way, it ricochets." Shaq nodded. "So how do we fire it?" "You don't." "I do." She opened a secure messaging app and started typing. "There's a civil rights lawyer in Atlanta, Corbin Hale. He's not flashy, doesn't like cameras, but he's the one who cracked the police corruption scandal in Tallahassee last year. If we hand this to him the right way, he'll launch a case so big, the mayor won't sleep for a month." Shaq looked at her. "Why not take it to the news?" "Because the media's own, Shaq, especially local. You want truth? You go legal first. Law before lenses. When the case is public record, the news can't twist it." She hit send. Within minutes a reply came. "Let's talk." Shawnee didn't smile. She just closed her laptop and looked at Shaq. "It's moving now." What followed wasn't fire and noise. It was strategy. Shawnee began assembling documents, connecting names from Mamaro's research with political donors, linking Braden's uncle to land development contracts with the mayor's office. She worked like a surgeon, dissecting the power structure with quiet, brutal efficiency. 3 days later, Corbin Hale arrived. He was unassuming, black-framed glasses, faded suit, soft-spoken but his eyes were razor-sharp. He didn't shake hands with fanfare. He walked in, opened a file, and laid out a plan so precise, it felt like a chessboard already 5 moves deep. "This is a pattern," he said. 3 kids raised in elite homes, protected by power, committing a hate-motivated act with premeditated language and a systemic cover-up. That's not a civil suit, that's a federal one. He handed Shaq a document. You'd be the lead plaintiff. Shaq hesitated. I didn't want to be the face of a lawsuit. I just wanted people to know the truth. Corbin met his gaze. Being the face is telling the truth. Loudly, Lucille spoke for the first time in hours. You step into this, baby. You don't come out clean. This town'll make you out to be the villain before the ink's dry. Shaq nodded. Then let him try. And just like that, the paperwork was filed. By daybreak, the story had cracked the local scene. The Savannah Tribune ran a front-page article headlined, O'Neill files federal lawsuit alleging systemic racism. Police cover-up. But it was what happened next that made the temperature drop. The threats stopped. Just like that. No more spray paint. No more anonymous messages. No more crowds outside the house. It was too sudden. Too quiet. Shawnee noticed it first. This isn't surrender, she said. This is recalibration. Shaq agreed. They're not done. They're regrouping. Corbin pulled out a series of public records he'd requested. He laid them on the table. Look at this, he said. And the mayor's office quietly withdrew 3 land contracts this morning. All connected to Judge Greeley's brother-in-law. Someone's pulling plugs. It wasn't a coincidence. This lawsuit wasn't just a fire. It was a threat to the whole machinery. Every piece of corruption, every backdoor deal, every racial gatekeeping tactic the city had relied on for decades was now one subpoena away from exposure. And so, the power players did what power players do. They stopped swinging. They started scheming. Shawnee leaned against the wall, arms folded. They're going to come after your image, Shaq. Not with slurs this time, but with spin. Resurrect old debts, twist old interviews, pull quotes out of context. Shaq didn't flinch. Let them. Shawnee stared at him, eyes sharp. You really ready for that? You ready to have your legacy torn up just to make them uncomfortable? He nodded slowly. My legacy ain't trophies. It's what my daughter remembers when I'm gone. I want her to say I stood up. Mira looked up from her phone, eyes glassy. Then I'll stand with you. And suddenly, something shifted. This wasn't about the body cam anymore. It wasn't about 3 boys and 1 dog. It was about power that had been unchallenged for too long. It was about truth taking its first breath in a city that thought it had buried it for good. Shawnee closed her laptop, satisfied. This is how we start a reckoning, she said. And everyone in the room knew. They weren't afraid anymore. They were ready. It was late morning when the news broke, buried halfway through a press release from the city attorney's office, cloaked in the language of bureaucratic closure. No press conference, no public apology, just a statement posted online, bland and bloodless. In light of recent developments, 3 juvenile individuals have accepted responsibility for their role in the incident involving Mr. Shaquille O'Neal's dog. Due to their cooperation, age and lack of prior criminal history, the court has approved a sealed resolution. There will be no further comment at this time. Shaq read it twice, jaw clenched so tight he thought he might crack a molar. Mara sat across the room, scrolling through her feed, eyes dry but dimmed. Even Lucille, usually ready with a sharp word or sharper wisdom, simply stood at the kitchen sink staring out the window, dish towel in hand, motionless. Shawnee was the first to speak. They didn't confess. They negotiated. Corbin Hale was already 2 steps ahead, flipping through court documents. No trial, no record, no real consequence. They'll walk back into their lives like nothing happened. And the city? Shaq asked without looking up. Corbin sighed. They're calling it resolution, closure. The paper'll call it a step forward. Shaq stood up slowly.
They're calling it over.
He didn't yell, didn't throw anything. He just walked to the back door and stepped outside, letting the screen slam behind him. Justice was lying in the shade near her half-built new doghouse. Her fur had begun to fill back in around the scars, her tail thumping lightly when she saw him. He knelt beside her, running his hand down her back, and exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because while the boys might have confessed, nothing in the air felt like justice. In the days that followed, the silence returned, but not the peaceful kind. The city exhaled like it had dodged something heavy. News anchors pivoted to stories about property tax reform. The mayor attended a ribbon cutting for a new museum and smiled for photos like the ground beneath him hadn't just trembled weeks earlier. But underneath the surface, The rot remained. Mira's inbox filled with silence from friends who used to text daily. Her classmates avoided her in hallways or whispered when she passed. A group of boys had snickered behind her in the cafeteria, one of them muttering, maybe she should walk her dog somewhere else next time. Lucille started noticing the same black sedan parked down the street more than once a week. At first she wrote it off. Then one night, it idled for nearly an hour with its lights off. No one got out. No one knocked, but it was a presence. Like someone wanted her to know they were close enough to touch her, if they wanted to. Even Shaq's endorsement deals began to shift. One brand paused their partnership, pending further public stability. Another ghosted his rep completely. There were no cancellations, just silence, strategic distance, a slow and subtle unraveling of status, as if being too vocal, too visible in the face of injustice had somehow made him radioactive. Shaq didn't say much, but his silence wasn't surrender. He was watching. And what he saw more than anything else was that the attack on justice had never just been about a dog. It had been a message. A warning shot wrapped in cruelty, meant to test whether he'd bark or bite. And now the boys had admitted it, but only after the city built them a velvet ramp to confession. No public scrutiny, no mugshots, no apology, just a sealed resolution, and a quiet reminder that some families get to rewrite the rules in real time. Shaq sat down one night, at the dining table, the whole family around him, and he said it aloud for the first time. This was a power play. They were never afraid of me. They were afraid of what I stood for. A black man who didn't need them, who didn't owe them, who didn't kneel. Shawnee nodded. And now they're hoping you fade out with grace. Lucille looked up, eyes narrowed. You think they're done? No, he said. They're satisfied. Which is worse, they think they've reset the board. Corbin spoke next. So the question is, do you accept the win they're offering? Quiet dignity, public silence. Or do you escalate? Shaq looked at him, then around the room. Justice, still healing. Mira, still hurting. Lucille, still being watched. Shawnee, still fighting. And himself still standing. I don't accept silence dressed as peace, he said finally. If I let this lie, every black kid in this city learns the same lesson we've been fed for generations. Speak up, and they bury the truth. Push back and they'll call it progress while they erase the harm. Shawnee's voice was soft but steady. Then we go again. This time, it wasn't about lawsuits. It was about exposure. They would take every sealed record and put its shadow on display. They would interview families, collect testimonies, open their own archive of systemic negligence. No courtroom this time. Just truth. Public. Documented. Irrefutable. Shaq picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. An old sports journalist, now running an independent documentary studio, answered on the third ring. Dale, it's Shaq. You still hungry to break something real? There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Always. The next chapter of the battle began, not with lawyers, not with fire, but with stories. Stories that dug deeper than any headline. Stories that made people look at themselves in the mirror and ask what kind of justice they'd been applauding. As Shaq hung up, Lucille leaned over and whispered something only he could hear. Sometimes a confession is just a performance. But a reckoning? That's a show they can't cancel. Shaq nodded, his voice steady.
Then let's raise the curtain.
The folder sat thick and heavy on Shaq's lap. But it wasn't just paper, it was weight. Generations of closed doors, whispered deals, wounds sealed with silence and dressed as policy. Inside that folder was something no one in Savannah's City Hall had ever expected would exist in one place. Proof, not rumors, not accusations, not speculation, but contracts, emails, recordings, names. Mamara had helped build the timeline. Shawnee stitched it together. Corbin vetted every document. What started as a few scattered threads had grown into a web of deliberate obstruction. A decades-long pattern that quietly locked black families out of business permits, zoning approvals, home ownership, and civil appointments. Shaq had always known it existed. Lucille had lived it. But seeing it all laid bare was like touching a live wire. The same three boys who stomped justice were raised in houses paid for by the corruption this evidence outlined. Their names were footnotes in property transfers, buried under LLCs registered to cousins of councilmen. The attacks, the silence, the sealed records, they weren't just acts of racism. They were rituals of protection for a system that couldn't afford to be seen. Now Shaq held the match. The room buzzed as he entered City Hall, Not because of who he was, but because of what they feared he might say. The chamber had never been this full. Rows of seats packed with reporters, local activists, church elders, even teenagers wearing t-shirts with Justice's paw print on the front, and "We Remember" on the back. At the far end of the room sat Mayor Kenneth Risto, wearing a navy suit, and an expression like he was already calculating how many spins it would take to survive what was coming. Next to him, Police Chief Donald Garrity leaned back in his chair, arms folded tight. Commander Griggs sat farther down, eyes lower than usual, not meeting Shaq's gaze as he approached the front. Shaq didn't bring a lawyer. He didn't bring a microphone crew. He brought his voice in a small box, sealed, that he placed on the podium before he spoke. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, when the silence stretched too far, he leaned into it. "My name is Shaquille O'Neal. Most of you know me as Big Shaq. But today I'm not standing here as a celebrity. I'm not standing here as a businessman. I'm standing here as a son, a father, a neighbor, and a witness." He opened the folder slowly, the sound of the pages turning like thunder in the still air. For years, families that looked like mine were told, "We're sorry, the application didn't go through," or "We'll get back to you," or "The grant just wasn't a fit this time." But behind those words were signatures, patterns, plans. He began reading names, dates, percentages. Over 60% of business contracts approved in the last decade went to companies linked to 10 households. 8 of them connected to former or current city officials. Of the remaining 40%, only 6% were Black-owned. Only 3 Black-owned businesses received zoning variances, none of them within proximity of high-traffic retail zones. Not one Black family appointed to any civic board since 20. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The mayor's jaw tightened. "And you know what ties this together?" Shaq continued. "The boys who attacked my dog, the ones who called me a big ape, didn't just grow up in hate, they grew up in profit. They were raised in homes bought with checks signed by silence, protected not by ignorance, but by design." He reached into the box beside him and pulled out a printed email exchange. It was from the mayor's office, sent 2 years ago, discussing zoning exemptions for a development project. In the email, a staffer referred to a local Black entrepreneur by name and wrote, "Deny gently. No backlash. We need that corner for the new retail front. Judge Greeley's nephew is in." Gasps now. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Reporters flipped open laptops, pens flying across notebooks. Shaq didn't stop. He laid out policy after policy, each a brick in the wall built to keep his people out. Every example bore names, real names, no longer hiding behind titles or job descriptions. Then came the twist. He pulled up a video from a projector one of Corbyn's interns had wheeled in minutes before the meeting started. It was an interview, not with a city official, but with a retired clerk from the zoning board. She looked straight into the camera and said, "We were told to slow down Black applications, not deny them. Just enough red tape to make them walk away. We had a code name for it, paper stall. Everyone knew it. Nobody wrote it down, but we all did it." The chamber went quiet again. Cold, electric. Shaq stepped back from the mic. "This isn't revenge," he said, voice steady. "It's accountability. It's the truth, and you don't get to bury that anymore." He turned to the mayor, looked him dead in the eye. "You tried to spin my story. You tried to paint me as emotional. You let your godson commit a hate crime and walk away. You called what happened an unfortunate misunderstanding. But what's unfortunate isn't what happened to justice. It's what this city's become while pretending it's not sick." He turned toward Commander Griggs. Their eyes met, and for a long time neither said a word. But the look on Griggs's face said everything. Regret, shame, resignation. "I believed you once," Shaq said quietly. "You said you'd protect the people. But the moment power knocked on your door, you opened it and stepped aside." Griggs didn't respond. He just looked down at his hands. Shaq's final words echoed through the chamber like a bell. "Justice didn't just get attacked that day. She got sacrificed. Because I stepped outside the lines of what this city expects from someone like me. Wealthy, quiet, grateful. But I'm not here to make y'all comfortable. I'm here to tear the mask off this system, and we're not going away." As he walked away from the podium, the room remained still. No applause, no shouting, just the crack of something deeper, something institutional. The feeling of old structures losing their footing. The mayor tried to speak but stumbled. Reporters crowded him. A few council members stood up and slipped out the back. Outside, a group of local youth leaders began chanting, "Truth! Truth!" It wasn't a protest. It was a beginning. Back at home, Lucille met him at the door. She didn't ask how it went. She'd seen it live. Instead, she just handed him a glass of sweet tea and said, "Took long enough." Marmura wrapped her arms around him from behind. Shawnee sat on the couch, her laptop open to half a dozen news sites already running the story. Shaq stood in the center of the room, the folder still in his hand. Because today, the ground beneath them shifted. And this time, it didn't shift under their feet. It shifted under the city. He smiled just thinking about it. Up the block, Lucille was climbing the church steps, flanked by 3 young students. Her hand on a cane she didn't need but carried anyway, more like a baton than a crutch. She'd started visiting schools weekly, speaking not from bitterness but clarity. She didn't scold. She told stories about marching, about hunger, about watching entire systems bend to protect the guilty, and about the long, slow labor of change. Justice, she'd once said to a group of 6th graders, ain't a moment. It's a rhythm. You gotta dance with it even when the beat disappears. And they'd clapped like they were at church. Across town, Shawnee had moved into an apartment in Savannah. Nothing flashy, just clean walls, good light, and space enough for 2 people who didn't need to define what they were anymore. She and Shaq weren't talking about labels. They were talking about peace, about family dinners, about old inside jokes they hadn't said in years. One evening last week, she made gumbo while he washed the dishes. No tension, no past, just now. She'd kissed him on the cheek when she left and said, "No expectations, just timing." And Shaq for once didn't feel the urge to explain anything. City Hall had changed too. The mayor had resigned 2 months after the hearing. No press conference, just a folded statement and a quiet exit. The chief of police had taken early retirement. Commander Griggs had remained, to the surprise of many, but not as the silent company man he once was. He'd testified in the federal review that followed, handed over documents and publicly apologized to Shaq and his family on camera. "I didn't just let you down," he said. "I let down an entire generation of people who trusted us to serve without fear." Shaq had nodded politely, but forgiveness didn't come with one sentence. It came with action. And Griggs was working now, not to save face, but to salvage integrity. His department had adopted transparency reforms. Body cam footage was released within 72 hours. Officers now trained with community panels. Trust wasn't rebuilt. It was being rebuilt. Outside City Hall, a new plaque had been mounted on a stone pedestal, not to honor Justice as a victim, but to remember her as the spark. It read, "To Justice, who could not speak, but made a nation listen." Shaq stood in front of it now, running his hand over the bronze inscription. Justice sniffed at the base, tail flicking, nostrils twitching like she sensed what it all meant. "She looks good," said a voice beside him. Shaq turned. Corbin Hale, now running for a statewide legal advocacy seat, stood in a simple charcoal suit, coffee in one hand, binder in the other. He hadn't stopped moving since the case cracked open. His name was being mentioned alongside national civil rights leaders. But he still made time to check in, still wore scuffed boots, still knew every intern's name. "She's stronger than me?" Shaq said, rubbing the dog's head. Corbin nodded. "She carried a truth people didn't want to see. That makes her revolutionary." They stood in silence for a moment before Corbin asked, "You ready for the symposium next month?" Shaq smirked. "I'm speaking, not preaching. I'll be fine. People still need to hear it." "I know," Shaq said, "and I will." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to drift lower, Shaq and Justice made their way back home. A group of teenagers on the corner looked up and waved, not with awe, but with respect. One of them called out, "Hey, Mr. O'Neill, thanks for what you did." He smiled. "I didn't do it alone." As he reached his porch, Mayra was already there, painting something on a canvas. Headphones in, one foot tapping, Lucille was reading in the shade, glasses perched low, and inside, Shawnee was on the phone, negotiating a grant for the center. It wasn't a picture-perfect ending, but it was honest. Heard one, and it was theirs. Justice limped up the stairs beside him, slow but steady.
The world hadn't become perfect.
But it had changed. And now, as neighbors passed, some waved. But most, they stood. If this story stirred something in you, don't just scroll. Speak. Share it at your dinner table, your school board, your next town hall. Change starts with a whisper, but it takes a community to turn it into thunder. The system counted on our silence. Let's prove them wrong.